Chapter 1. The music box buried in snow was during one of those desolate January stretches, when the fog hangs low over Baker Street like the breath of a sleeping giant, that the curious case of Mr. Archer Greaves was first brought to our attention. The weather had conspired to still the city in a hush of frost, and Sherlock Holmes had not left our rooms for several days, pacing intermittently and playing a somber etude on the violin that never quite reached its final cadence. I, for my part, was grateful for the reprieve from blood and scandal. We had only just returned from a grim affair in Dorset, involving a drowned baronet and a cryptic pattern of alchemical symbols scrawled across a cellar door. I had hoped that Holmes would take some rest, physical if not intellectual. That hope dissolved, as so many did, with the appearance of Inspector Lestrade. He arrived just after 8 o'clock, stamping snow from his boots in the hall, his moustache rimmed with frost, and his manner unusually hesitant. I ushered him in, noting that Holmes had already turned from the window, as if anticipating his arrival. "You are just in time, Lestrade," Holmes said, without looking at him. I had nearly resigned myself to reading Watson's monograph on enteric fever again. The inspector gave a humorless chuckle. "I doubt this will improve your mood, Holmes. It's the strangest death I've seen in 20 years. "Ah," Holmes said. "Then do sit down." Lestrade did, removing a sheaf of notes from his coat. "The victim's name is Archer Greaves, a solicitor of good standing, bachelor, 47, lived alone in a cottage outside Hawthorne Glen in Surrey. Yesterday morning, his housekeeper, a Mrs. Dalton, found him dead in the garden." "In the garden?" I asked at this time of year. Lestrade nodded. "That's the first odd part. The entire property was blanketed in snow the night before. Unbroken snow except for a set of footprints from the rear of the house to a bench beneath a linden tree. Greaves was found sitting there, frozen solid, coat open, no gloves, dead as stone." "And the footprints?" Holmes asked, steepling his fingers. "Only his," said Lestrade grimly. "No sign of a second person entering or leaving, not even near the house. The door was bolted from the inside. No tracks to the road, no disturbances near the windows. It's as if the man walked out into the snow, sat down, and chose to die." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. Then, softly, "Men rarely choose such things under neat conditions. There's more," Lestrade added. "Something found beside the body, a small music box half buried in the snow. It was still playing when Mrs. Dalton found him. Just 3 notes, over and over." "Was it his?" I asked. "Not according to anyone who knew him," Lestrade replied. "And here's the strangest part. The tune, it matches the melody Greaves used to whistle in court. A habit, apparently, when cross-examining. Always the same 3 notes." At this, Holmes sat forward. "Describe them." Lestrade shrugged. "I'm no musician. D, F sharp, B flat, I think they said. Same every time, like a signal." Holmes rose and walked to the window, and there were no signs of struggle. None, and no cause of death that the doctor could find. Just exposure, though that makes no sense. He wasn't out long enough to freeze naturally, and the expression on his face. He trailed off. "What of it?" Holmes asked, without turning. Lestrade swallowed. He looked surprised, as if someone had just whispered something he didn't expect. For a while, there was only the soft ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes remained at the window, watching the snow descend in slow, swirling spirals. "Tell me," he said at last, "how much do you know of Greaves' last case?" Lestrade blinked. He'd just defended a young woman, Elise Braddon, acquitted of poisoning her employer. Public opinion was against her, but Greaves won the case with some clever maneuver about chain of custody. "Why?" "Because," Holmes murmured, "men like Greaves do not die for no reason. And if the snow was undisturbed, Lestrade, then the killer never walked through it." He turned, his eyes alive with a spark of purpose. "They brought the murder in something smaller, something mechanical, something left playing in the snow." His gaze fell to the hearth. "A music box." I stared at him. "You think he was killed by sound?" "I think," Holmes said, "we must go to Hawthorne Glen at once, before the melody fades." Chapter 2. The solicitor's house. By noon the following day, Holmes and I were aboard the 12:45 train bound for Surrey. The sky beyond the window was the same iron grey that had hung over London for a fortnight, and the countryside lay swaddled beneath a crust of snow, the hedgerows hunched like old men, and the trees skeletal in their winter nakedness. Holmes is wrapped in his greatcoat and scarf, said little for the duration of the journey. He had brought neither book nor newspaper, only a thin file tied with black twine. From time to time he untied it to study a photograph clipped to the top page, an image of Archer Greaves in profile, seated in what must have been his office, one hand raised mid-gesture and a slight smile at his lips. He was a man of precision, Holmes said quietly, tapping the edge of the photo. Look at the way his pen is placed parallel to the blotter, the way the brass lamp is aligned perfectly with the edge of the desk. The pose is accidental, but the arrangement is not. I peered over. So you believe this was a man unlikely to act on impulse? Precisely. And yet he walks into a snow-covered garden, without gloves, sits beneath a linden tree, and dies. And you suspect he was lured? Holmes's eyes narrowed. Lured, perhaps, compelled. More likely. When we reached the station at Hawthorne Glen, the air bit at our faces with a sharpness that made even Holmes wince. Lestrade was waiting with a hired trap, stamping his feet beside the horses. Afternoon, gentlemen. Hope the ride wasn't too rough. Quite bearable, Holmes said, climbing aboard. Have there been any developments? None, Lestrade said. The body's still at the cottage, as you asked. Local constable was ordered to keep it undisturbed. Mrs. Dalton hasn't returned since she found him. She's staying with her sister in Dorking, refused to sleep another night in that house. And the music box? Holmes asked. Lestrade patted a leather satchel. Brought it with me. It's well. Have a listen when we arrive. The road to the Greaves property curved up a low forested hill and descended into a narrow vale. The house revealed itself gradually, a red brick cottage with steep gables, window panes rimed in frost, and an air of forgotten privacy. A hedgerow wall, flanked by 2 iron gates, surrounded the garden. Even from a distance, I could see the bench beneath the linden tree. The snow around it was muddied now by the footprints of policemen and villagers, but one could still make out the trail, Greaves's trail, leading from the rear door in a perfectly straight line to the place where he died. Holmes stepped down from the trap, and his demeanor changed instantly. He was no longer a passenger. He was a bloodhound. We entered the cottage first. The sitting room was neat, to the point of sterility. Not a book out of place, not a cushion askew. Everything shone faintly with polish and order. Holmes moved from one surface to another, examining the fireplace, the umbrella stand, the scuttle beside the hearth. Watson, he called, and I joined him at the writing desk. Notice anything? I looked closely. The inkpot was full, the blotter clean. A stack of correspondence lay unopened beside a sheaf of legal briefs, but it was the envelope on top that caught my eye. The name read simply, "To be opened only in the event of my death." Holmes didn't touch it. "A man does not prepare such a letter casually," he said. Yet there are no signs of prior distress, no notes in his journal, nothing to suggest a planned departure. Lestrade appeared in the doorway. "Would you like to see the music box now?" Holmes nodded, and the inspector drew it from his satchel. It was no larger than a child's palm, silver-plated, the metal tarnished in places, the winding key delicately filigreed. Holmes took it with great care and examined the underside. "There's no maker's mark," he muttered. "Unusual." He placed it on the desk and wound the key. 3 notes rang out, soft, metallic and haunting. D, F sharp, B flat. Then silence, and again, D, F sharp, B dash flat. Holmes closed his eyes. The rhythm is deliberate, slow, almost like a heartbeat slowed by sleep. "You think it was a signal?" I asked. "I think it was a summons," Holmes said, and stopped the mechanism with a gloved finger. Outside, we moved to the garden. The snow was trampled now, but Holmes studied it as if it still bore secrets. He knelt beside the bench, brushing away the remaining frost from the wooden slats. He stared for a moment in silence, then reached forward and pressed his hand against the backrest. He frowned. "Warm, no, humming." He stood. "There's a cavity beneath. Come, help me." With Lestrade's assistance, we shifted the bench enough to reveal a narrow trapdoor beneath it, nearly flush with the earth, its edges concealed by frost and overgrowth. Holmes produced a small penknife and pried it open. A wooden compartment lay beneath, perhaps 2 feet deep, holding only a thin velvet-lined tray. In it sat a second music box identical to the first, except this one was broken. Its mechanism snapped. The winding key twisted. Holmes stared at it. 2 boxes, he murmured. "One to play, and one to receive." I stared at him. "Receive what?" Holmes turned to Lestrade. "I need a list of every client Archer Greaves represented in the last 12 months, and I need it tonight." Lestrade blinked. "You think this has something to do with the case?" "I think," Holmes said softly, "that Archer Greaves did not die alone. He died answering a question only he could hear." Chapter 3. The Echo in the Snow. That evening, we returned to a modest inn on the edge of Hawthorne Glen, its beams sagging under snow and age. Holmes had secured a private parlor where we could examine the evidence in warmth, though he insisted on keeping the window slightly ajar, allowing in a thin current of cold air. He said it sharpened the mind. I suspected it merely made him feel closer to the crime. Lestrade arrived shortly before 9 with a bundle of ledgers, wrapped in brown paper and secured by a length of twine. He looked wearier than before, his nose red from the wind and his moustache wet with melting frost. "Every active file from Greaves last year," he said, dropping the bundle onto the table. "No duplicates, no omissions." His clerk in London was surprisingly cooperative. Holmes nodded his thanks but said nothing. He untied the bundle and began leafing through the files at once, his long fingers scanning the spines of manila folders, as if searching not for a name, but a shape, a rhythm. "Anything in particular we're looking for?" I asked. "Anything that repeats," Holmes replied. Greaves was an orderly man. If a pattern emerged in his clientele, he would have documented it consciously or not. We worked late into the night. Holmes cross-referenced names, scribbled notes in tight columns, and traced arrows between clients I barely recognized. I helped as best I could, but the tangle grew knottier with each passing hour. It was just past midnight when Holmes made a low sound in his throat. "Watson," he said, lifting a file. "What do you make of this?" I took the folder. It was labeled Clara Milverton, Probate and Estate Defense. She inherited her husband's estate 2 months ago. I read, challenged by her stepdaughter. Greaves represented her. Holmes laid a second file beside it. Charles Adair Libel Defense. A schoolmaster, Holmes said, accused by a parent of improper conduct. Greaves won the case, citing forged letters and character evidence. A third file appeared. Elise Braddon Homicide Defense. All 3 cases had 2 things in common. The public despised the client. The evidence, though damning, was dismissed on a technicality engineered by Greaves. Holmes tapped the table. He was not merely skilled, he was surgical. He defended people the public had already judged guilty, and he did so with methods that dismantled appearances. "Are you suggesting someone sought revenge for justice undone?" I asked. "Possibly. Or perhaps something subtler, an orchestration of dissonance." Each of these clients was found innocent, but the outcome left a bitterness in its wake. Greaves silenced the chorus of guilt with law. At that moment, Lestrade, half asleep in an armchair, gave a snort. "You're making it sound like someone murdered him with an opinion." "Not quite," Holmes said, "but perhaps with an echo of one." He reached for the 2 music boxes and set them side by side on the table. "Let us assume the first box, the intact one, was meant to play a message, and the second?" I asked. He pointed to the broken mechanism. "It did not merely receive sound, it responded to it. Look closely." He passed me a magnifying lens. Under scrutiny, I saw that the internal components of the broken box bore thin scratches and tiny metal filings, almost as if it had attempted to play a note that resisted, over and over, until the gears broke. Holmes nodded at my reaction. An error loop, or perhaps a challenge. Someone sent Greaves a riddle in sound, and he, being a man who loved puzzles, attempted to answer it with another music box, or something else entirely. But the method is immaterial. The purpose, Holmes said, was to provoke a response, and in that response, something snapped. Lestrade sat up, rubbing his face. "You think someone killed him by making him think too hard?" Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "In the lamplight, I think someone exploited his need for order. He was a man who lived by patterns, legal, moral, intellectual. But this," he gestured to the melody, "this was outside pattern. 3 notes, endlessly unresolved. It asked a question that could not be answered. So he broke." I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "Not in body, but in equilibrium. The garden, the snow, the absence of violence, these were not accidents. They were arrangements." He enacted the only response he could fathom. He stepped into the silence. A long silence followed. Then Lestrade said, "We'll need to speak with the Braddon woman again." Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "She's not in London," he said. I traced her forwarding address this morning. She left the city 3 days after the verdict. Where to? A boarding house. In Dover. Odd timing, I said. Not odd, Holmes corrected. Calculated. I suspect Miss Braddon knows more than she said in court, and I suspect someone wanted her far from the center of things. Lestrade began gathering the files. Shut. I wire ahead. No, Holmes said. We'll go in person. I want to see her face when she hears the tune. He looked again at the music boxes, then carefully placed them in his satchel. Outside, the snow had begun again, fine and silent as falling ash. Holmes stood by the window a moment, watching the street lamps glow faintly in the dark. A solicitor, who dismantled truth, he murmured. A melody no ear can finish, a death by silence. He turned to us. We are no longer investigating a crime, we are chasing a question. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. The journey to Dover was long and bleak, the train rattling through a corridor of grey trees and half-buried tracks. Holmes said little throughout, though he kept the music boxes wrapped in flannel and resting on his lap, as if they were volatile cargo. His brow was low, eyes half-lidded, not from sleep, but from internal movement. I recognized the look. A theory was forming, but it had not yet surfaced. We arrived just after 1 in the afternoon. The air by the coast was sharper than in London, the wind carrying a faint scent of salt and stone. We made our way to a boarding house on Wellington Road, an unremarkable structure of narrow proportions and faded shutters. A carved placard above the door read, "The Violet Thistle Rooms let weekly." Inside, the landlady, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Kelso, greeted us with suspicion that melted only slightly upon Holmes presenting his card and the barest flash of Scotland Yard's authority. "Elise Braddon, you say?" She sniffed. "She's upstairs, second room on the left. Quiet one, pays on time, never causes trouble. Don't fancy her much, if I'm honest. Always watching, and not in the polite way." Holmes nodded. "Has she had visitors?" Mrs. Kelso hesitated. "Only the gentleman in the grey coat, thin as a rake, bit of a hunch, came twice, always after dark. Name, didn't give one, but he left something odd the second time. Little parcel, no address, just a blank envelope on top. I didn't open it, of course." Holmes looked to me. "The grey coat again?" I nodded, recalling Lestrade's note about a man of that description, seen near Greaves' cottage the week before. We climbed the narrow stair. Holmes knocked once lightly, then again, harder. No answer. He gave me a quick look, then knocked a third time with an unusual rhythm. 3 taps, pause 2, taps, pause 1, D, F sharp, B flat. There was a moment of silence behind the door. Then, the bolt drew back. Elise Braddon was not what I expected. Younger, perhaps, early 20s, dark hair drawn into a severe knot. She was thin, not from neglect, but from deliberation. Her eyes, wide and heavily lashed, did not blink as she stepped back to let us in. "I knew someone would come," she said softly. The room was sparsely furnished, iron bedstead, cracked mirror, a wash basin and pitcher. On the writing desk sat a half-burned candle and several folded letters, each unopened. The air smelled faintly of rosewater and dust. "I am Dr. John Watson," I began, "and this is Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "I know who he is," she replied, "and I know why you've come." "Do you?" Holmes asked. She turned her gaze to him. "Archer Greaves is dead." Holmes offered no confirmation, only a small nod, barely perceptible. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice like a leaf brushing glass, "but he died because of me." Watson and I exchanged a glance. "Explain," Holmes said. Elise stepped to the desk and took something from the drawer, a letter, creased and yellowed, marked only with Greaves's seal. "He sent this to me 2 weeks after my acquittal," she said. "He said he had uncovered something that cast doubt not on my guilt, but on the guilt of all his recent clients." Holmes opened the letter and scanned its contents. It was brief, barely a paragraph. The ink trembled, as if written, "In haste or fear, Miss Braddon, you must leave London. There are forces, ideologies, perhaps that I believed dormant, which are now proving otherwise. You are free in the eyes of the law, but not safe. The trial was only the overture. Beware of anything that plays music. Destroy it. Do not reply." "I burned the parcel that came last week," she continued. "It played something only once and I destroyed it." "What did it play?" Holmes asked, already knowing. She swallowed. 3 notes, always the same, over and over, D F sharp, B dash flat. Holmes drew a breath. then reached into his coat and produced the unbroken music box. He placed it on the desk, but did not open it. "Elise," he said, his voice low but even, "we believe these music boxes are part of something greater, a pattern of deaths, disappearances, or You must tell us who else knew about the letter, who else Greaves feared." She turned to the mirror, her face reflected back twice, once in glass, once in shadow. "I don't know his name," she said, "but Greaves called him the satirist, said he wore civility, like a mask, said he'd begun creating cases, false charges, real evidence, all just to test how far the law could be bent." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A provocateur, a legal engineer." "Yes," she whispered, "and he used music the way others use. Signatures, a calling card, but also a lock." A knock at the door interrupted us. Holmes crossed quickly, peered through the keyhole, then opened it slowly. Standing outside was a man in his 40s, hollow-cheeked, impeccably dressed, with spectacles and a walking stick tipped in brass. He did not smile. "Miss Braddon," he said, "I believe you have something that does not belong to you." Holmes stepped in front of her. "And you are?" he asked. The man blinked slowly, as if studying a child's question. "I," he said, "am the man who sat too still." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away into the dark. Chapter 5. The Red Herring. The man had disappeared by the time Holmes and I reached the street. We stepped into the cold dusk, eyes straining down both ends of Wellington Road. But the grey figure had melted into the fog, as though swallowed by it. Holmes did not curse or fret. He merely stood still, watching the mist roil and drift over the cobblestones like breath on glass. He wanted to be seen, Holmes said after a pause, not followed. "Do you believe him to be the satirist?" I asked. "I believe him to be the final movement of a phrase we have only just begun to hear." We returned to the boarding house, to find Elise Braddon seated again at her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she held her teacup. She did not look at us when we entered, but said softly, "He was in the courtroom, you know, at my trial. I thought he was just another solicitor." Holmes stepped forward. "Did he speak to you then?" "No, but he smiled, once, as if the whole proceeding was a rehearsal." We left her with a constable posted at the door, and returned to the Violet Thistle's parlor. There, Holmes penned a brief wire to Lestrade, requesting immediate information on any recent clients of Archer Greaves who had attempted legal retaliation or voiced violent intent following a lost case. He handed the telegram to the innkeeper's boy and resumed pacing the floor, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You think someone else will be blamed," I said, watching him. "I am counting on it." Holmes replied, "Every melody needs a false note." By late morning, Lestrade arrived by coach from London, his cheeks flushed with cold and urgency. He strode into the room with a triumphant expression and a stack of papers under his arm. "Well, Holmes," he said, "I believe I've got our man. Name's Alton Rook, ex-client of Greaves. Sued his former employer for industrial injury, lost the case. Blamed Greaves for poor representation, made public threats, and was arrested last year for attempting to burn the solicitor's office. Recently released. I had the local constable bring him in this morning." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Was he found with a music box?" "No," Lestrade admitted, "but he owns a clockmaker's workshop in Bethnal Green, makes custom mechanisms. It's not a stretch." Holmes turned slowly toward the fire. "Rook is a brute, Lestrade, loud, predictable, full of sweat and slogans. He's no more the architect of this crime than the ink in your pen." "Then who is?" Lestrade asked irritably. "Someone who understands silence, someone who hides in the seams." "Holmes," I said, "we did see someone, and he declared himself plainly enough." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and because of that, I must assume he is lying." Lestrade grunted. "Well, whether he is or he isn't, I'll still need to question him. You have a name?" Holmes shook his head. "None that would hold. But Rook is not your man. If you pursue him, he'll only confirm it belligerently, vocally, and with every ounce of desperation. He may have fantasized about Greaves' downfall, but he did not orchestrate it." Lestrade paced a few steps, then turned. "Suppose you're right. Suppose this grey-coated ghost is our true adversary. What then?" "Then we follow the pattern," Holmes said, opening a notebook. "We examine each of Greaves's controversial acquittals from the last year. We look for clients whose release offended public sensibilities and, more importantly, cases where new lives were built atop old ruins. You think someone is punishing those who profited from legal escape? I asked. Worse, Holmes said. I think someone is proving a theory that justice, once bent too far, snaps not back into place but the other way entirely. Just then, the boy returned with a telegram. Holmes opened it, scanned the brief message, and handed it to me. Clients with confirmed post-trial incidents. Elise Braddon, threats after acquittal. Charles Adair, school closed after scandal. Disappeared 6 weeks ago. Clara Milverton died of apparent suicide 1 month after inheriting estate. No inquest held. Lestrade Metropolitan Police records. I read it aloud. When I finished, Holmes tapped the paper. 2 are gone. 1 remains. Elise, I said. He nodded. And we've already seen the attempt on her. The question is, why has she survived when the others did not? Luck, Lestrade offered. No, Holmes said quietly. She destroyed the music box. The signal never completed. We sat in silence, the implications sinking in. Then Holmes stood, fast and precise. I must speak to her again. She may not know the full story, but she knows enough to finish the tune. We returned to the boarding house, but as we reached the top of the stairs, the constable outside Elise Braddon's room was gone. The door stood slightly ajar. Holmes drew his pistol. I followed close behind. Inside, the room was empty. The window was open. No footprints on the sill. No sign of struggle. On the desk, a fresh envelope unmarked, sealed in black wax. Holmes opened it. Inside was a single slip of parchment, folded once. On it, 3 musical notes, drawn by hand. D.F. Chapter 6. A hidden inconsistency. The silence in Elise Braddon's room was more chilling than the open window. No overturned chair. No broken pane. Not even a single footprint on the floor. Her absence was an extraction, precise, noiseless, surgical. Holmes stood still for a long moment, his back to me, the slip of parchment held between 2 gloved fingers. She did not flee, he said. How can you be sure? I asked. She left nothing behind. No bag, no coat, not even her boots. A woman does not vanish barefoot through a frozen window without urgency or duress. This was not a retreat, an abduction. Then, Holmes didn't answer. He moved to the window and examined the latch, running a finger beneath the sill. He withdrew it a moment later and held it up dusty dry. Window hasn't been opened. In days, the cold would have left condensation. The sill would be damp. No, this was arranged. From the inside, I asked, or by someone who made it appear that way. He turned suddenly and crossed the room to the wardrobe. He flung it open, rummaged through the few garments hanging there, and pulled a thin strip of paper from the lining of Elise's overcoat. Folded into the shape of a music note, it bore a single line of ink in angular, elegant script. When the measure breaks, the silence sings. He handed it to me without a word, then swept. From the room we took a cab to the train station immediately. Holmes had already wired Lestrade, instructing him to remain in Dover and canvass the local post offices, piano tuners, and instrument makers. His theory, still unspoken, was beginning to take form in sharp lines and colder logic. We are missing something fundamental, he said, as the train began its eastward lurch. A fracture buried beneath the case itself. The pattern, I asked. He nodded. We assumed the music boxes were calling cards, tools of intimidation. But what if they are more than that? What if they are messages, not to the victims, but to each other? The boxes are communicating, I asked, incredulous. Not in the traditional sense, Holmes said, but each box bears the same 3 notes, and the arrangement, the progression is mathematically curious. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small notebook, flipping to a page where he had notated the notes from memory. D, F sharp, B flat. It is a tritone, the most unstable interval in Western music, known in medieval theory as diabolus in musica, the devil in music. It does not resolve, it creates tension. A question, never answered, which you believe is the point, I said. Exactly. Each box is not a signature, it is a provocation. He grew silent for the remainder of the journey, and it wasn't until we were approaching London that he stirred again. There was something wrong at Greaves's cottage. He said suddenly, "You mean the bench and the trapdoor?" "No, earlier, much earlier." He frowned. "Watson, do you recall the writing desk?" "Of course." The inkpot was full. The blotter was clean. There was a letter addressed in the event of my death, yet no quill had touched parchment. That day, no signs of recent writing. The man had a fear for order, yet left his most final message in a sealed envelope without trace of composition. I saw it at once. You're saying it wasn't written there? Precisely. That envelope was placed as if someone knew he would die, and when and wished to guide our interpretation. He nodded sharply as we pulled into Charing Cross. Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He removed the broken music box from its velvet tray and dismantled it across his work table. Beneath the gears and pins, he discovered a false bottom and extra layer of brass beneath the main cylinder. Beneath it, a sliver of parchment. He read it aloud. 3 minds, 3 notes. The one who falters, finishes first. 3 minds, I echoed. Greaves, Adair, Milverton. Holmes nodded grimly. Each of them received a box. Each faced a moral inversion. Greaves defended the guilty. Adair taught lies. Milverton inherited death. Each one a test, and each one destroyed. But Elise, I said. She was accused of a crime, but claimed innocence. Greaves freed her. Perhaps that is what saved her. Holmes murmured. She destroyed her box. She refused the question. There was a long pause. Holmes, I said slowly, do you think the music boxes are part of something larger? Not merely punishment, but recruitment. Holmes looked up sharply. It is not impossible. Recruitment for what? He tapped the sliver of parchment. For a philosophy. One without mercy. One that sees the law, not as justice, but as failure. He stood abruptly and began packing his satchel. Where are we going now? I asked. To Greaves's clerk, he replied. The files we received were too precise. I want to see who packed them. We arrived at the solicitor's former office near Lincoln's Inn, shortly after dusk. The clerk, a nervous man named Henry Foyle, met us in the entryway, his hands still ink-stained. I packed the papers myself, he stammered. As requested, Holmes's gaze was sharp. Did you notice anything unusual in the days before Mr. Greaves's death? Foyle hesitated. There was one thing. Speak. A man came to see Mr. Greaves the night before he left for Surrey. He had no appointment, but Mr. Greaves saw him anyway. They spoke behind closed doors for almost an hour. When he left, he dropped something. This Foyle reached into his drawer and withdrew a playing card. It was entirely black, save for a single white symbol in the center. A tuning fork crossed with a quill. Holmes took it carefully, turning it over. On the back was a line of music notation, the same 3 notes, but this time they resolved D, F sharp, B flat, G dot. The final note had been added. Holmes stared at it. They've begun to answer, he whispered. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. It began with a violin, not Holmes's usual excursions into Paganini or Bach, but a single note drawn out slowly and deliberately hovering in the air like a tuning fork suspended in fog. It was early morning, and the candlelight still flickered against the frost-laced panes of Baker Street. I had barely spoken 2 words since breakfast when Holmes brought the bow down across the strings with that aching, deliberate stroke. D. He waited, hand poised, eyes closed. Then dash F dash sharp, then dash B dash flat. And silence. Why do you keep doing that? I asked, setting down my untouched tea. You've played that sequence a dozen times. I am trying, Holmes said, to feel what they felt. I stared at him. What? Who felt? Greaves, Adair, Milverton. Each of them heard this, before they died, not merely as sound but as implication. I don't follow. Holmes stood, setting the violin aside. Then allow me to guide you, Watson. You've always been an able student of deduction, even if your instincts are lamentably moral. Thank you, I think. He paced the length of the room. Let us accept for a moment that this tritone is not simply a signature, but a cipher. Not a code in letters or numbers, but in psychological effect. D, F sharp, and B flat. Together they formed the tritone, the devil's interval, historically banned in sacred music, unstable, unresolving. It creates unease, tension, but more importantly it begs for completion. And the final note? I asked. G, he said, as seen on the card retrieved from Greaves's office. The 4th note, the resolution. I frowned. But what happens when the sequence is completed? Holmes gave me a sharp look. They die. He picked up the newspaper clipping from Adair's carriage. All 3 victims received the first 3 notes, but it was only when the 4th was introduced, whether by box, resonance, or hidden message, that the ... effect took place. You speak of it as if it was some kind of hypnosis. Holmes didn't answer. He opened his notebook instead and showed me something I hadn't seen before, a grid, rows of notes, each corresponding to case files. Elise Braden's box played only the first 3. She destroyed it before the final note could be delivered. That's why she survived, at least initially. She interrupted the composition. And the others? Greaves's box was broken posthumously, but I suspect the 4th note arrived through other means, perhaps through vibration or an external trigger. Adair, we know, received it through the carriage wall. Milverton still uncertain. So this is music as weapon, I said slowly. Or rather, as execution. No, Watson, Holmes said. This is music as judgment. He walked to the hearth and stared into the fire. We must invite the conductor. You mean the killer? I mean the composer, Holmes corrected. The one arranging these deaths like staves on a page. How he turned and gave me that rare look, the one he only offered when he'd arrived at a decision that made even him uneasy. I shall pretend to be a believer. I stood slowly. A believer in what? In the message, Holmes said. In the composition. If they are testing minds for resonance, looking for those who understand, then I must let them believe I hear the song. He crossed to the desk and began writing, rapidly, fluently, as if the thoughts had been waiting for his pen. When he finished, he sealed the letter in black wax and handed it to me. Post this to the address I shall give you, he said. It is taken from the envelope left at Greaves's cottage. A false name, a blind box number, yet I believe it will reach the intended recipient. I hesitated. And what does the letter say? Holmes gave me a half smile. That I understand. That I, too, see the law as a performance. That I, too, have heard the final note. My stomach sank. You're baiting them. Of course I am, he said. Would you rather we wait for them to strike again? 3 nights passed. Each evening, Holmes performed the tritone on his violin. Sometimes he added the G. Sometimes he added the G. Sometimes he did not. The air in Baker Street grew tense, thin, expectant. Then, on the 4th night, it arrived. Not a letter, but a parcel, small, square, wrapped in oil paper and string. No markings, no seal. Mrs. Hudson claimed it had been left at the doorstep some time after midnight. Holmes did not open it immediately. He placed it at the center of the sitting-room table and simply stared at it, as if waiting for it to speak. Eventually, he cut the string. Inside was a music box. Unlike the others, this one was unblemished, new, fashioned from ebony and brass. On the lid, a carved motif, a conductor's baton over a single eye. Carefully, Holmes murmured. He opened the lid. The mechanism clicked, and the music began. D.F-sharp B-flat, G.but. Then something new. A 5th note, higher, delicate. A. Then silence. Holmes closed the lid. Slowly they've replied. I watched his face. It was pale. The hand on the table was trembling slightly. What does it mean? I asked. He looked at me. It means they accept. Accept what? That I have joined the orchestra. There was a long silence. Then Holmes stood and walked to the window, where the street outside was soaked in moonlight. Now, Watson, he said, we must prepare for the next movement. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. It began with a violin. Not Holmes's usual excursions into Paganini or Bach, but a single note drawn out slowly and deliberately hovering in the air, like a tuning fork suspended in fog. It was early morning, and the candlelight still flickered against the frost-laced panes of Baker Street. I had barely spoken 2 words since breakfast when Holmes brought the bow down across the strings with that aching, deliberate stroke. D. He waited, hand poised, eyes closed. Then F-sharp. Then B-flat. And silence. Why do you keep doing that? I asked, setting down my untouched tea. You've played that sequence a dozen times. I am trying, Holmes said, to feel what they felt. I stared at him. What? Who felt? Greaves, Adair, Milverton. Each of them heard this, before they died, not merely as sound, but as implication. I don't follow. Holmes stood, setting the violin aside. Then, allow me to guide you, Watson. You've always been an able student of deduction, even if your instincts are lamentably moral. Thank you, I think. He paced the length of the room. Let us accept for a moment that this tritone is not simply a signature, but a cipher. Not a code in letters or numbers, but in psychological effect. D, F-sharp, and B-flat. Together they form the tritone, the devil's interval, historically banned in sacred music, unstable, unresolving. It creates unease, tension, but more importantly, begs for completion. And the final note? I asked. Yea, he said, as seen on the card retrieved from Greaves's office. The fourth note, the resolution. I frowned. But what happens when the sequence is completed? Holmes gave me a sharp look. They die. He picked up the newspaper clipping from Adair's carriage. All 3 victims received the first 3 notes. But it was only when the fourth was introduced, whether by box, resonance, or hidden message, that the ... effect took place. You speak of it as if it was some kind of hypnosis. Holmes didn't answer. He opened his notebook instead and showed me something I hadn't seen before. A grid, rows of notes, each corresponding to case files. Elise Braden's box played only the first 3. She destroyed it before the final note could be delivered. That's why she survived, at least initially. She interrupted the composition, and in the others, Greaves's box was broken posthumously. But I suspect the fourth note arrived through other means, perhaps through vibration, or an external trigger. Adair, we know, received it through the carriage wall. Milverton still uncertain. So this is music as weapon, I said slowly. Or rather, as execution. No, Watson, Holmes said. This is music as judgment. He walked to the hearth and stared into the fire. We must invite the conductor. You mean the killer? I mean the composer, Holmes corrected. The one arranging these deaths like staves on a page. He turned and gave me that rare look, the one he only offered when he'd arrived at a decision that made even him uneasy. I shall pretend to be a believer. I stood slowly. A believer in what? In the message, Holmes said. In the composition. If they are testing minds for resonance, looking for those who understand, then I must let them believe I hear the song. He crossed to the desk and began writing, rapidly, fluently, as if the thoughts had been waiting for his pen. When he finished, he sealed the letter in black wax and handed it to me. Post this to the address I shall give you, he said. It is taken from the envelope left at Greaves's cottage. A false name, a blind box number. Yet I believe it will reach the intended recipient. I hesitated. And what does the letter say? Holmes gave me a half smile. That I understand. That I, too, see the law as a performance. That I, too, have heard the final note. My stomach sank. You're baiting them. Of course I am, he said. Would you rather we wait for them to strike again? 3 nights passed. Each evening, Holmes performed the tritone on his violin. Sometimes he added the G, sometimes he did not. The air in Baker Street grew tense, thin, expectant. Then, on the 4th night, it arrived. Not a letter, but a parcel small, square, wrapped in oil paper and string. No markings, no seal. Mrs. Hudson claimed it had been left at the doorstep some time after midnight. Holmes did not open it immediately. He placed it at the center of the sitting-room table and simply stared at it, as if waiting for it to speak. Eventually, he cut the string. Inside was a music box. Unlike the others, this one was unblemished, new, fashioned from ebony and brass. On the lid, a carved motif, a conductor's baton over a single eye. Carefully, Holmes murmured. He opened the lid. The mechanism clicked, and the music began. D.F, sharp, B flat, G. But then something new. A 5th note, higher, delicate. A. Then silence. Holmes closed the lid. Slowly, they've replied. I watched his face. It was pale. The hand on the table was trembling slightly. What does it mean? I asked. He looked at me. It means they accept. Accept what? That I have joined the orchestra. There was a long silence. Then, Holmes stood and walked to the window, where the street outside was soaked in moonlight. Now, Watson, he said, we must prepare for the next movement. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. It was the morning of the 5th day when the second box arrived, not to Baker Street, but to Scotland Yard. Lestrade's call came shortly after 8. Holmes listened without a word, then lowered the receiver and stood still for several long seconds. He did not move until I said his name. Holmes. It has begun, he said quietly, just as I feared. The carriage ride to Scotland Yard was tense. Holmes sat with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on something I could not see. He spoke only once, and even then, his voice was low, almost to himself. The 5th note. It was an invitation, but not to me alone. When we arrived, Lestrade met us at the top of the stairwell, pale and flustered, a crumpled telegram in one hand. It came this morning, he said. no postage, left directly at the desk, addressed to me by name. He led us into a small evidence room and gestured to the package on the table. It was nearly identical to the one Holmes had received, same oil paper, same string, but the wax seal was different. 3 vertical lines, uneven in length, a musical staff, perhaps. Holmes approached it with gloved hands. He didn't open it immediately. Did anyone else handle this? No, Lestrade said. I isolated it as soon as I saw what it might be. Haven't let a soul near it. Holmes nodded and slowly undid the string. The lid clicked open with a soft chime. The box began to play D.F #B-flat G.A then-C. A sixth note. Holmes's eyes widened fractionally. This is new, he murmured. A different progression. Lestrade looked puzzled. Is that bad? It means escalation. As the final note faded, Holmes examined the interior. Unlike his own box, which had been pristine, this one bore a scrap of red silk inside the lid. Holmes plucked it free and held it up to the light. It was torn from a garmenter's sleeve, perhaps frayed along the edge. On one corner, stitched in gold thread, the letter H. He said nothing, but I saw his expression change, tighten. Then he turned to Lestrade. Where is Inspector Hopkins? Lestrade blinked. Stanley Hopkins. He's not on this case. Where is he? I believe he's in Surrey. Why? Holmes moved to the door. Because he's the next one. We arrived at Hopkins's cottage in Weybridge just before noon. It was a modest dwelling, tucked behind a hedgerow near the river. The chimney puffed gently, but there was no sign of movement through the front window. Holmes didn't knock. He walked directly to the side door and produced a key from where I still don't know and let himself in. Inside, the fire was burning low. A teacup sat untouched on the sideboard. The clock ticked, solemn and slow, but no Hopkins. Too quiet, Holmes muttered. He moved from room to room, swift and surgical. Then Watson. I followed the cry to the study. Hopkins sat slumped in his reading chair, head tilted back, one arm dangling off the side. Holmes was already at his side, fingers on the man's neck. He's alive, he said, but only just. On Hopkins' lap sat a music box open, playing nothing. The mechanism had been jammed with a brass pin. Deliberate. Holmes removed it carefully. Beneath the box, on the floor, lay another note. The harmony weakens. Your instruments fail. He turned to me. Watson, his pulse is slowing. I sprang into action, drawing my satchel open and beginning resuscitation efforts. Fortunately, it appeared the effects were not yet complete. A vapor of some kind lingered, in the air faintly bitter. I suspected laudanum, perhaps belladonna, enough to still the senses but not to kill. At least, not quickly. Hopkins stirred within 10 minutes. Holmes knelt beside him, speaking softly. Who gave you the box? Hopkins blinked. A boy said it was from you. Holmes's jaw tightened. Did he say anything? Hopkins nodded weakly. He said the composition was unfinished, and you had to hear it. Holmes stood, his fists clenched. They are sending a message, he said, to you. I asked. No, to the system. He turned to me with sudden urgency. Watson, we must go back. Now, if they have reached into Scotland Yard and into my own circle, then they have finished testing. He paused. They are ready to perform. Back at Baker Street, we found another envelope waiting. Plain cream-colored, no seal. Inside was a single line, written in the same crisp, angular hand. The first duet approaches. Listen closely. Holmes handed it to me without comment. Then, he crossed to his desk and opened the drawer where he kept his revolver. I must be ready, he said simply. For what? I asked. He stared out the window, where the shadows of carriages passed in silence below. For the moment, he said, when the music chooses its own player. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to succeed. Was past midnight when Holmes emerged from the depths of his private archive, dust in his hair, ink on his sleeves, and a glint in his eye I had not seen since the affair of the naval treaty. Dropped 3 folders on the floor before the fire, and knelt among them like a scholar before scripture. Watson, he said, do you remember the Lindmore Tribunal? I blinked. Barely. Wasn't it some old case involving a land dispute in Kent? Holmes gave a wry smile. That's how the newspapers painted it. But it was more than a dispute, it was a crucible. 3 powerful men, all on the bench, Sir Edward Milverton, Charles Adair, and Felix Greaves, and at the center of it, a young woman named Ariane Elkhart. I recognized the name instantly. She was accused of arson burning her family's orchard. I remember reading something about her collapse during the trial. Indeed, Holmes said, what the public never knew was that Elkhart was defending herself alone. No counsel, no testimony in her favor. Her father had vanished, her brother died in a fire, and her mother had been institutionalized. I furrowed my brow. And what happened? She was convicted, Holmes said softly. Sentenced to 10 years, but she served only 3. Released after a judge reversed the conviction in private, citing new evidence that mysteriously disappeared before it could be reviewed. Let me guess, I said. The judge who reversed it was Greaves. Holmes nodded. And Adair, I asked, lobbied to keep her imprisoned. Holmes replied, he believed her guilty and, I suspect, delighted in it. Milverton recused himself late in the proceedings, citing conflict of interest. So, I said slowly, you believe Ariane Elkhart is behind this? No, Holmes said. I believe she's dead. I stared. She died 2 years ago, in an asylum near Dover. Starved herself to death. The attending physician noted. Her final words, it plays. Still, it plays. I felt a chill climb up my spine. And yet, Holmes continued, someone else has taken her melody and built upon it. Someone who knows every inch of that trial, every cruel silence, every deliberate omission. I sat back, a sympathizer. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, a student. He stood and returned to the parcels. From the Greaves file, he extracted a courtroom sketch. It showed the accused, Elkhart, seated and expressionless. But beside her, in the gallery, was a young man, no name, no record. Every sketch of the trial includes this figure, Holmes said, never noted by the court, always seated in the exact same position. He handed me a second sketch, this one from a later day of the trial. The same man, same seat, watching. The conductor, I murmured. Holmes nodded. I believe so. But who is he? I don't yet know, Holmes said. But I can tell you what he is. He crossed to his violin and drew the bow once more. D F sharp, B flat, GAC, the notes, he said, are not random. They follow a logical musical language known as serialism. Each note forms part of a 12-tone row, where no pitch is repeated until all have been used. Serialism, I asked. A compositional technique, Holmes explained, developed by modern theorists, radical, orderly, total, but not widely known, except by students of the avant-garde, the disillusioned, and the profoundly methodical. He began sketching a diagram. 12 tones, 12 jurors, 12 years since the tribunal, each death a movement, each note a choice. I saw it now, the deeper structure, the logic beneath the murders. This isn't revenge, I said. It's a composition. Holmes met my eyes. Yes, and I fear it is nearly finished. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes opened it and read. Silently, then he handed it to me. Asterisk 2, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, 221 B Baker Street, from Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. 4th incident. Target, Judge Rupert Tolliver, survived. Box found destroyed. One witness claims to have seen a man in a conductor's cloak near the scene. Vanished before he could be followed. Message found carved into the judge's desk. Fugue builds. Counterpoint begins. Asterisk. Holmes turned to the fire and stared into it, his expression hollow. They're layering now, he murmured, beginning to interweave themes. I felt a deep unease. If this is a fugue, I said, then what's the subject? Holmes looked at me with strange intensity. Justice, he said, or what remains of it. He sat down slowly, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair in rhythm with a melody only he could hear. This is no longer about the tribunal alone, Watson. That was merely the overture. Now the composer is drawing in new voices. Tolliver, perhaps even me. The melody is twisting, becoming self-aware. I watched him grow still, his brow furrowed. Then he said something that chilled me to the bone. The conductor is not merely punishing. He is teaching, and I fear his next student will be chosen not for guilt but for talent. Chapter 11. The Bait-Holmes Grand Strategy. The following morning broke with a slate-colored sky and a raw wind that rattled the panes of 221 B Baker Street. I found Holmes at the window, unmoving, his gaze lost beyond the frost-etched glass. His violin lay on the table, the bow still gripped loosely in one hand. He hadn't slept. I must compose a message, he said finally, not turning to face me. A response, a challenge. I watched as he moved to the writing desk. drawing forth fresh paper and uncapping his pen. He wrote quickly, each stroke sharp and deliberate. "They think I am a fellow performer," he said, "an ear tuned to their fugue. Let them believe it. Let them believe I am ready to conduct." I approached cautiously. "What exactly are you saying to them?" "That I've found their pattern," he replied. "That I understand the logic and admire it." "Holmes," I said, "you're dancing on the edge." He looked at me then, and I saw the weariness etched into his face, less from fatigue, more from the weight of abstraction bearing down upon him. "Watson," he said softly, "you do not defeat a composer by playing a different tune. You must write a variation, one compelling enough to draw them out." He sealed the letter and addressed it to the same cryptic blind box in Shoreditch that had previously yielded a reply. Then he summoned a boy from the street and paid him double, to ensure its quiet delivery. When the door closed, Holmes turned to me with rare solemnity. "I shall disappear for 3 days. I started. "What?" "They will not answer while I am under observation," he said. "But if I vanish, if I appear to go underground, perhaps in flight or madness, they may approach directly. They want a pupil, Watson, or at the very least, a witness." He began packing a valise with peculiar items, a false beard, a battered notebook, a case of vials, even a small harmonium. "Where will you go?" "I cannot say," he replied. "Not even to you. Not this time." "Holmes," I said, stepping forward, "if they strike, they won't kill me," he said calmly. "Not if they still believe I'm listening." Before he departed, he handed me a letter, sealed and marked open only if I do not return by the 4th night. Then he was gone. The next 2 days passed in strained silence. I kept the fire lit at Baker Street. I maintained correspondence with Lestrade, who was monitoring movements across the city. No further boxers appeared. No victims surfaced. It was as though the fugue had paused mid-measure. Then, on the 3rd evening, I received a telegram from Montague L. "The performance proceeds. Final movements imminent. All ears to the stage." The name meant nothing to me, but then the envelope caught my eye. Inside the flap, faint but unmistakable, was a small embossed symbol, a conductor's baton over a single eye, the same symbol engraved on the music box that had arrived for Holmes. I raced to Scotland Yard. Lestrade met me in his office. Already pale. "There's been another," he said. My stomach turned. "Who?" He hesitated. "A critic, Jonathan Reel, music correspondent for the Times." I frowned. "Why him?" Lestrade spread the file across the table. "He wrote a scathing piece 3 years ago on a composer named Edmund Kell. Claimed his work was mathematically impressive, but emotionally bankrupt. It ruined the man's debut. Kell vanished soon after." Holmes's voice echoed in my mind. "They are not merely punishing, they are teaching." I read through the file quickly. At the bottom, attached with a rusted paperclip, was a concert program from Kell's failed performance. The title of the piece, "Elegy in 12 Voices. My Breathcourt. Kell. Montague, L.A. pseudonym." I rushed back to Baker Street. The fire was out. The flat, dark dot, but on the desk lay a package, Holmes's violin, carefully wrapped in cloth, and a letter, addressed to me. I tore it open with trembling hands. Watson. "I am near the center now. If you are reading this, it means I have stepped into the hall. The orchestra is assembled. The baton is raised. I do not yet know whether I shall play or conduct, but I shall know soon. Follow the coda. SH**. There was no signature beyond that, just a single line of musical notation at the bottom 6 notes. D F sharp, B flat, GACAND. Then a rest shaped like a door, just beginning to open. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. I departed Baker Street at dawn. Holmes's cryptic letter tucked in my breast pocket, and his violin case clasped under my arm like some sacred relic. The city stirred into a grey morning, its sounds oddly muted, as though London itself were holding its breath. I did not know where I was going, only that I had to follow the coda. That phrase, like so many of Holmes's, seemed at once maddeningly obscure and sharply precise. In music, a coda marks an ending, an epilogue, affixed to a composition's close. But Holmes, I was sure, meant something more. A place, a clue, a pattern embedded not in melody, but in memory. And then I remembered. Holmes and I once attended a private concert at the Royal Academy, an evening of experimental arrangements that tested the limits of tonality and nerve. I remembered Holmes whispering, This Kell fellow has all the rigor of Batch and none of the mercy. I had laughed, but Holmes did not. His expression had been dark. That was the night Edmund Kell disappeared from the London musical scene, his name slowly dissolving into obscurity. I hailed a cab and gave the driver an address I hadn't thought of in years, Hargrave Hall, a now conservatory nestled in the East End, its facade crumbling behind locked iron gates. Before his disgrace, Kell had studied there and, as Holmes once noted, spent hours alone in its chapel-like rehearsal hall, composing fugues that no one asked to hear. As the cab pulled away and I stood before the wrought iron entrance, I felt a sudden stillness like stepping into a vacuum. No wind, no bird call, just the hollow air of expectation. The gates were unlocked. Inside, the halls were dim and heavy with dust. I passed through corridors of silent pianos, cracked metronomes, and music stands rusted into place. And then I heard it. A single note, soft, sustained, carried, not by an instrument, but by the air itself, vibrating faintly against the bones of the place. I followed it. The note guided me to the old recital room. Its oak doors stood half open, revealing a chamber of shadows. In its center stood a grand piano, lit only by a circle of pale morning light that cut through the broken dome above. Holmes was seated at the instrument. He looked up as I entered, not startled, not pleased, merely resigned. "Watson," he said, "you're safe, for now." He gestured for me to sit beside him. "I feared you were gone," I said. "In a way, I was," he murmured, "but not yet entirely." He placed a hand on the keys, drawing forth the first four notes of the motif. D, F, B flat, G. "I found him," Holmes said. "Montague Elth, the name used to rent the box in Shoreditch. It is indeed a pseudonym for Kell." "So he is the conductor," I breathed. Holmes nodded. "He adopted the name after the tribunal. He vanished from the public stage, but not from music. He began composing again, but not on paper, on people." I felt a coldness spread through my chest. "But why this?" I asked. "Why murder, Holmes? Why boxes and fugues and cryptic messages?" Holmes lifted a page from the music stand. It was handwritten, dense with notation, tempo markings, and strange symbols. "This," he said, "is the score of Elegy in 12 voices. It is not music in the traditional sense. It is a schema, a chart of correspondences, each victim a key, each phrase a death." He traced a line from the opening bar to the end. Kell believed that the tribunal destroyed not only Ariane Elcott, but his own soul. He had loved her, perhaps distantly, perhaps without ever speaking it aloud. Her trial shattered his belief in structure, in fairness. And so, he set out to create a new structure, one that punished, judged, and resolved. "And the boxes?" I asked. Holmes glanced toward the shadows in the rear of the room. "They were tuning forks," he said, "designed to create emotional dissonance, to prime the listener with a sequence they could not complete. Each recipient was forced to feel the incomplete chord, to internalize its tension. And when the final note arrived, I whispered, 'They resolved it.'" Holmes finished, unconsciously, psychologically, and in that moment of resolution, they were vulnerable to suggestion, to despair, to guilt. He turned to me. "It was not hypnosis, Watson. It was invitation." He let them write their own endings. A figure stepped into the light from the rear alcove, a man in his early 50s, thin, angular, with hair combed neatly back and eyes that glittered with intensity. He wore a black overcoat and held a conductor's baton loosely in one hand. "Kell," I breathed. He bowed faintly. "Dr. Watson, you followed beautifully." Holmes rose slowly. "It ends here, Edmund." "No," Kell said, his voice low and resonant. "It ends where you choose to place the rest." He stepped forward, baton tapping lightly against his palm. "I did not select you by chance, Holmes," he said. "You were always meant to hear it. You, more than any of them, understand that the world is dissonant, ruled by chaos masked. As law, you seek pattern. So do I. Ours is a duet of logic." Holmes's voice was calm. "Yours is a melody of destruction." "No," Kell said, his eyes widening. "Mine is a redemption. I give order to the random, justice to the overlooked." He raised the baton. "Play with me." Holmes took a step forward, hands at his sides. "No." Kell hesitated. "I've already completed your fugue," Holmes said, "and I've found its flaw." Kell faltered. "There is no flaw. You resolved your own grief by assigning its structure," Holmes said. But your structure is not universal, it is a mirror. It reflects only your pain. Kell's hand trembled. I see you now, Holmes said. Not a conductor, not even a composer. A man sitting alone at a piano, hammering the same notes, hoping one day they will sound like forgiveness. Kell let the baton fall. The silence that followed was not empty, it was release. He said nothing as Holmes approached, only closed his eyes. I watched as Holmes gently took the baton from his hand and placed it on the piano lid. And then, at last, the music stopped. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. We emerged from Hargrave Hall just as the first flakes of snow began to fall, silent, listless flakes that floated down like forgotten notes from a fading score. Holmes and I flanked Kell on either side, our coats drawn close against the wind. He offered no resistance, no plea, only the occasional glance upward, as if the snow itself might rewrite what had come before. I had half expected an ambush or a desperate last lunge, but Kell remained, composed, detached. It was not surrender, but something colder, resignation without remorse. Where are we taking him? I asked as we reached the street and hailed a cab. Holmes answered without looking at me. To Scotland Yard. There must be a reckoning, even for those who compose theirs. The ride was quiet. Kell stared out the window, and Holmes kept one hand inside his coat. I knew what he was holding, the small, pearl-handled revolver he carried only on the rarest of cases, not for defense, but for completion. We arrived without incident, and Lestrade met us at the doors, his face drawn but alert. You found him? He asked, almost incredulously. Holmes nodded. He came willingly. Lestrade raised a brow at Kell. And this is the chap who's been leaving those boxes. Kell gave a polite nod, as though being introduced at a dinner party. Lestrade signaled to constables. Take him to the interview room. Stay with him. No one in or out until I arrive. As they led Kell away, Lestrade turned to us. You've done it, Holmes. The Yard will be singing your praises by nightfall. I'd rather they didn't sing at all. Holmes muttered. We followed Lestrade to his office, where a fire burned and papers were strewn across his desk, articles, photographs, police reports. In the corner sat an unopened music box, its seal untouched. Another gift from Kell, perhaps, or something left behind during the chaos of the investigation. Holmes studied it for a long moment. You didn't open it? He asked. Lestrade shook his head. Wasn't sure if it was safe. Nor am I, Holmes murmured. He lifted the box gently and examined its edges. A small symbol was carved into the bottom, an interlocking series of descending lines. A coda, a final mark. Holmes drew a long breath. This wasn't meant for any of the victims, he said. It was meant for himself. I frowned. You mean Kell planned? But Holmes was already turning. To the cells, he said. Now, we arrived at the holding corridor to find chaos. One constable lay unconscious outside the interview room. The other stood inside, blood trickling from a gash above his eye, his pistol missing. The room itself was empty. Kell was gone. Lestrade swore and barked orders. I rushed to the fallen man and checked his pulse, alive, but barely. Holmes, meanwhile, stood utterly still in the center of the room. He timed this perfectly. He said, softly. He knew the protocols, knew how long the handover would take, knew the officers by name. I rose. He planned to be caught. Yes, Holmes said, because he needed to be inside. Inside, what? But Holmes didn't answer. He strode out into the corridor and headed for the evidence room. I followed, confused, until we reached the door, and there, lying beside it, was the discarded baton, not broken, placed. His rewriting the final movement, Holmes muttered. Inside the evidence room, the music boxes were gone. All of them. A note lay in their place. The orchestra but the soloist remains. Holmes stared at it for a long time, then looked up slowly. He's not running, he said. He's performing. I felt a sick chill. Performing what? The encore. Within the hour, a report came in. Explosion at the Southwark Theatre. No casualties, thank God. Just smoke, some shattered glass, and the unmistakable echo of a music box playing from the rafters. Holmes and I arrived just as the fire brigade doused the last of the embers. The theatre was empty, Kill, nowhere to be found. But in the orchestra pit, someone had left behind sheet music. Holmes picked it up and scanned the bars. This is new, he said. Not part of the original fugue. What does it mean? Holmes's voice was low. He's improvising. We stood there in the cold theater, the burned velvet and broken lights all around us, and I saw Holmes's shoulders shift just slightly, a hesitation, a breath caught on the edge of something unspoken. "He's not done, is he?" I said. "No," Holmes replied, "but he's no longer trying to kill." I blinked. "Then, what?" "He wants to be understood." Holmes looked around the ruined theater, then back at me. "This is no longer a murder case, Watson. It is a confession, one composed in 12 voices, across 12 years, and now at last he wants to be heard." Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed Holmes did not sleep that night, nor did I. The fire in our sitting room had burned to ash by the time dawn broke, but Holmes remained at the window unmoving, his eyes fixed on nothing yet, seeing everything. He was composing something in his mind, not music, something worse. "What are you looking for?" I asked finally, my voice low. He didn't turn. The missing voice. I stood from the armchair, rubbing at the ache in my spine. "You said Kell's fugue was complete 12 movements, 12 victims, but he escaped. Doesn't that mark an ending?" Holmes shook his head. "The fugue is not just a litany of murders, Watson. It's an argument, and arguments require contradiction, dissonance, resolution." He walked to the desk and unfurled the burned sheet music recovered from the Southwark Theatre. The notes were charred at the edges, but legible. "See here," he said, pointing to a progression. "This is a fragment of a harmonic inversion, from Kell's original elegy in 12 voices but rewritten, slower, less rigid." He tapped another bar. "This is new. These notes were not part of the original performance. He's composing again, not for others now, but for himself." I stared. "What does it mean?" "It means Kell has come to understand what he lacked," Holmes murmured. "He thought structure would save him, that logic would protect him from loss, but in chasing perfection, he destroyed what made the fugue human." I nodded slowly, not quite grasping where this was leading. Holmes stepped toward the hearth, where his violin case rested. "Watson," he said, "do you remember the letter Kell sent you?" "Yes." "May I see it again?" I retrieved it from the sideboard and handed it to him. He unfolded the paper and held it to the light. "Look," he said, tilting it slightly. "There, just at the base of the staff." It was faint, but visible in the morning light, and pressed in but never inked. Holmes traced them aloud. "Return where silence first learned to sing." I blinked. "What does that mean?" Holmes's eyes lit with sudden clarity. "He's returning to the beginning, not the tribunal, not the trial. Further still, to where music first became meaning for him." He turned to me. "Hargrave Hall was where Kell studied, but where did he learn?" We raced to the archives. Holmes poured through the enrollment records from 20 years ago, searching for Kell's first formal schooling. "There," he said, tapping the page. "St. Cecilia's Orphan Academy, Surrey, age 7. Taken in after the death of both parents. Musical aptitude noted immediately." He closed the ledger. "That is where the final note lies." St. Cecilia's was a weather-beaten structure, its white stone stained with decades of rain and neglect. The headmistress, a stern woman with a voice like dry leaves, was hesitant to admit us until Holmes handed her a card bearing the seal of the Home Office. She ushered us inside with reluctant grace. "He was a quiet boy," she said, leading us down a corridor of portraits. "Bright, obsessive, always humming, never spoke much unless it was about music, but he loved the chapel." "Why the chapel?" Holmes asked. "It was the only place with a piano, old thing, broken strings, but he played it anyway." The chapel stood at the edge of the grounds, half swallowed by ivy. Its windows were shattered, the pews stacked to one side, and the piano a dilapidated upright rested beneath a large stained glass depiction of St. Cecilia herself. Patron saint of music. Holmes approached the piano and opened the lid. Dust flew from the keys. "He's been here," he said, brushing away a smear of fresh fingerprints. "Recently, he struck a key. It gave a wheezing note. He struck another D, then F-sharp B-flat. G. I shivered." Holmes bent over the keys, his eyes scanning the grain of the wood. Then he straightened and walked to the altar. There, tucked beneath a loose stone, was a sealed envelope. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of music and a note. Asterisk, "The fugue ends not in silence, but in surrender, not to justice, to feeling." E.K. Asterisk. Holmes studied the score, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat. "He's finished," he said. "The final voice is not one of murder. It is grief. Accepted, not corrected. I let out a slow breath. Do you think he'll turn himself in? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned back to the piano and pressed the final key in the sequence C. The note lingered. No, he said at last. He won't turn himself in, but he won't run either. He's left the score behind. The fugue has concluded, and in its place he paused. Silence. As we exited the chapel, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a faint prism through the shattered window. The light caught Holmes's profile, sharp, unreadable, and just a touch more human. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The day after our return from St. Cecilia's passed in a strange hush. Holmes was quieter than usual, and even Baker Street seemed subdued, as though the final echoes of Kell's fugue still lingered in the brickwork. Outside, London moved on footsteps, carriages, the occasional cry of a newsboy, but in our rooms, silence had taken residence. By evening, however, Holmes had stirred to action. He began making preparations for what he called the closing movement. I watched as he sent telegrams to Scotland Yard, to various names in his little black book, and even to the director of the Royal Academy of Music. He turned to me just past 6, his eyes sharp again. We must assemble them, Watson. Who? The audience. I stared at him. For what performance? Holmes merely gave me a small wry smile and resumed his work. By noon the next day, invitations had gone out. Within hours, a curious gathering was forming at an unused concert hall in Marylebone, a faded, dust-filled chamber with seats for 100, though only a dozen were expected to attend. I recognized them all as they arrived. Lady Evelyn Marston, still wearing the mourning black she'd adopted after her brother's suicide. James Halbridge, the critic who'd written a glowing piece on Ariane Elcat's early work, and later a condemnation of Kell's. Inspector Lestrade, 2 former jurors from the tribunal that ruined Elcat's reputation, the professor who had expelled Kell from the conservatory, and others, all minor players in a tragedy long buried, now summoned to hear its final note. Some entered with curiosity, others with dread. All seemed unsettled to see the others, unsure of what precisely they'd been summoned for. None had yet seen Kell, but his shadow, I felt, had arrived before them. Holmes greeted each with polite formality, offering no explanations. At precisely 1 o'clock, he stepped to the center of the small stage. There was no orchestra, only a single chair, a modest lectern, and beside them, a battered music stand holding one sheet. "Thank you for coming," Holmes began, his voice calm and crisp, cutting through the nervous murmurs. "You are here because you were part of a composition. Some of you knew it, most did not. But you were notes in a few, a sequence of actions and consequences, written by a man who believed the world had robbed him of meaning. That man is Edmund Kell." At the sound of the name, several in the audience shifted. One woman visibly flinched. Holmes continued, "You are not on trial, nor are you being accused. But you must hear the final movement." He gestured, and I stepped forward with a small phonograph, newly acquired for this purpose. Holmes handed me a lacquered cylinder marked, save for a single etched word, Requiem. I placed it in the machine and turned the crank. From the horn, soft and distorted by age, came the sound of a piano, hesitant at first, then fuller. A single motif emerged, D-F sharp, B-flat GAC, then a pause. And Kell's voice, older and worn, but unmistakable. "They say grief is silence, but silence is not absence. It is music, unplayed. I did not compose to kill. I composed to remember, to hold the moment before she fell into disrepute, before her name was twisted by committee, by critics, by men who hear only what fits their scheme. You all took from her, but I gave her a coda." There was another pause. The music resumed, now fractured, discordant, yet beautiful in its faltering way. Holmes let it play for nearly 3 minutes before lifting the needle gently. "No one spoke. Many of you remember Ariane Elcart as a gifted violinist whose career collapsed under suspicion," Holmes said. "But Kell saw her as the one pure thing he'd ever known, and when she was publicly humiliated because of a misattributed melody, no Lesker did not lash out. He withdrew, and then he rewrote the story. He let that settle before continuing. He selected you each, not because of guilt, but because of influence. You were not murderers, but movements. Each choice, each word, was a chord he could not unhear." Lady Marston rose suddenly. "This is monstrous," she said. "You cannot justify." "I justify nothing," Holmes said sharply. I explain. There is a difference. She sat back down, pale. Holmes walked slowly down the aisle. You were part of a performance you did not know you were giving. And Kell, in his own twisted brilliance, composed a counterpoint. He stopped near Halbridge. Your review ended her season. You dismissed her as a dilettante. That word cost her a fellowship. Halbridge looked down at his hands. And you, Holmes said, addressing a former juror, you believed you were upholding the truth, but you ignored context, ignored evidence. And so, a life unraveled. Holmes turned to the room at large. Kell's murders, those who did die, were carried out not by him, but by others, triggered through those infernal boxes, designed to manipulate, to induce guilt, despair, obsession, and in most cases, he merely provided the score. Lestrade spoke then, his voice low. And now, Holmes nodded. Now he has stopped. The fugue has ended. He left the final sheet in a chapel where he first learned to play. A silence followed, heavy and profound. Then someone asked, where is he now? Holmes gave no answer, because he didn't know, and neither did I. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes poured us each a drink, and unusual gesture, and a rare one, I am told. He said slowly, that fugues end with a return, a restatement of the theme. Do you believe he'll resurface? I asked. Holmes shook his head. I believe he's done. Not out of fear or defeat, but because, for the first time, the music played through him rather than against him. He tapped the edge of his glass. He was wrong, Watson, morally, legally, profoundly wrong. But his error was not madness. It was clarity twisted by grief. I looked at the fireplace, where shadows danced in solemn rhythm. Do you think she ever knew? Holmes was quiet for a moment. No, he said. And perhaps that was the only mercy in the whole affair. We sat there in companionable silence, and in that silence I thought I heard it again, that final chord, resolved. Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. It was several days after the gathering at the Marylebone Hall when Holmes finally spoke of Kell in full. Not in fragments, not in riddles, but with the precision of a man concluding the last movement of a performance composed in silence. We sat once more at Baker Street, the morning papers still awash with speculation. Scotland Yard remained quiet about Kell's whereabouts. There had been no sightings, no further music boxes, no sudden confessions or dramatic arrests, just silence. And yet, Holmes looked more certain than he had throughout the entire affair. Watson, he said, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, do you remember the opening bar of Kell's fugue? You mean the sequence from the first music box? He nodded. D, F sharp, B flat, G. The intervals themselves are nothing extraordinary, but they form the outline of a descending pattern melodically and psychologically. I frowned. You believe the fugue was a coded confession from the beginning? Not merely a confession, Holmes said. A blueprint. Kell's mind was architectural. He needed structure, symmetry, and above all resolution. And when that resolution was denied him after Ariane Elcott's fall from grace, he began to recompose reality itself. He stood and walked to the window. Each music box delivered to each victim was meticulously tuned, not just in sound, but in effect. Do you recall Ridley, the composer who flung himself from a bridge? I said, yes. His box contained a variation of his own unfinished sonata. Kell had taken the liberty of completing it flawlessly. The result, Ridley was forced to confront the ideal he could never reach. Holmes turned back to me. In each case, the box was not a threat. It was a mirror, a reflection of the recipient's deepest failure. He moved to his desk and laid out a grid: names, dates, key signatures, themes. Lady Evelyn Marston's brother received a box playing their mother's lullaby, modified, interrupted mid-phrase, like a voice choked on a final word. He was already fragile. Kell pushed him 1 inch further. And the critic Halbridge, I asked. His box played a string trio he'd once reviewed dismissively, only to discover too late that it had been plagiarized from Elcott's original score. The guilt, Watson, was not invented. Kell merely curated it. I studied the grid. You believe Kell killed by psychology? Holmes nodded. A slow poison, delivered by tune. He understood that murder by blade or bullet lacks permanence, but the mind, if turned inward, is capable of obliterating itself. He sat down and poured 2 cups of tea, more out of ritual than thirst. But the final turn, he said, was his decision not to finish the fugue with blood, but with surrender. You remember the letter he left at St. Cecilius? The fugue ends not in silence, but in surrender, not to justice, to feeling. Holmes tapped the page. He realized, finally, that what he sought was not revenge. It was recognition, not for himself, but for Elkhart, for the injustice she suffered, which was never acknowledged, never repaired. His final act, inviting those responsible to listen, to truly listen, was not an attack. It was an attempt at absolution. I was silent for a long moment, and yet, I said quietly, people died. Holmes's gaze met mine. Yes, that must never be romanticized. He was a murderer, elegant, articulate, perhaps, but a murderer nonetheless. He leaned forward, his voice low. But we must also understand how close we all stand to such madness. Kell's descent began not with rage, but with silence, with the decision to say nothing when Elkhart was disgraced, to turn pain inward, to build a cathedral of grief and call it justice. The room fell still. I reached for my notebook, not out of habit this time, but out of necessity. I began to write. The fugue of Edmund Kell was not composed in a day. It was forged in neglect, tuned in heartbreak, and performed in 12 keys of regret. But in the end, it was not Holmes who ended it, nor Scotland Yard. It was Kell himself, choosing to leave the stage before the final ovation. I looked up. Do you think he's dead? Holmes considered this. No, not in the conventional sense. But Kell, the conductor, the killer, he has concluded his piece. What remains is the man, and whatever notes he has yet to play. A long silence followed. Then, almost as an afterthought, Holmes reached beneath the couch cushion and drew out a plain brown envelope. It had arrived the morning prior. No return address, no postage. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the chapel at St. Cecilia's, and sitting at the old broken piano alone, in the dust and light, was a man with his back to the camera. Thin, upright, still. Holmes studied it. He did not answer. Instead, he placed the photo back into the envelope, sealed it, and tucked it into the hollow spine of a dictionary on the shelf. Some endings, he said, are best left unplayed. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. In the days that followed Holmes's final deductions, London resumed its rhythm, and troubled, unknowing. Newspapers speculated, pundits debated, and Scotland Yard quietly filed the case as partially resolved. A designation that satisfied no one and comforted fewer still. But inside 221B Baker Street, we understood something that would never make the broadsheets, that justice, in this instance, had not worn the garb of law, nor had it arrived in the sound of sirens or the weight of shackles. It had come in a softer, stranger form, a quiet reckoning, heard only by those willing to listen. Still, consequences had their place. Inspector Lestrade visited us 3 days. After the Marylebone Assembly, bowler in hand, face as tight as his collar. We've issued warrants, he said without preamble. Kell's name is now on every watch list from Southampton to Aberdeen. Holmes nodded, and yet, I suspect you'll never find him. Lestrade frowned. That's not for lack of trying. We've turned out the conservatories, the music shops, even the bloody asylum registries. It's like he evaporated. Not evaporated, Holmes said gently, concluded. He was never hiding from the law. Lestrade, he simply reached the final bar. The inspector sank into the armchair opposite mine. You'll forgive me if that sounds romantic. I would never forgive that, Holmes replied dryly, but I understand it. Lestrade removed his hat and sighed. There's pressure coming down from the Home Office. They want closure. They want something they can write into reports. What will you tell them? I asked. Lestrade looked. Between us, I'll tell them the truth, that Kell is gone, that his instruments are accounted for, and no further boxes have been discovered. And the victims? Holmes asked. The inspector's voice grew quieter. The families have been notified, privately, of course. We couldn't exactly publish how their loved ones were driven to it. Holmes folded his hands. What will you write in Ridley's death report? Lestrade glanced away. Suicide, though I'll note psychological manipulation as a contributing factor. And the others? Same. Holmes was silent for a moment, then spoke. You'll be criticized. You know. I always am, Lestrade said with a grim smile. But better criticized for what is, than praised for what never was. He stood, hat in hand. I'll leave you to your own paperwork. And Holmes, if he relapses, I'll know, Holmes said. That night, the fog returned to Baker Street. I stood by the fire, rereading the notes I'd gathered over the course of the case. The pattern was now as clear to me as any of Holmes's old puzzles, a sequence of grief, silence, escalation. Each victim a reflection of Elcott's erasure, each box a mournful echo. But the justice dealt to Kell was not the kind doled out in courtrooms. It was isolation, oblivion. That, in the end, was his sentence. And yet not everyone walked away untouched. 2 days later, I received a letter by post, forwarded from my clinic. The envelope was thick, sealed with red wax, and unsigned. Inside was a single page of music, handwritten, delicate, unmistakably Elcott's style. Below the final note were the words, "Not all voices must end in silence. Some find harmony." I showed it to Holmes. He read it once, then again, before handing it back. "Elcott?" I asked. "No," he said softly. Someone remembering her, someone ready to listen. By the end of that week, the papers had moved on. A political scandal in Parliament, a fire in Limehouse, another series of thefts in Kensington. But for Holmes and me, the echoes of Kell's fugue remained. One morning I awoke to find Holmes gone. No note, no clue, just the faint smell of ash from his extinguished pipe. He returned late that evening, his coat dusted with soil. "Where have you been?" I asked. "Brompton Cemetery," he said, brushing past me. "Visiting someone, burying something." It wasn't until the next day that I noticed the dictionary on the shelf. The one with the hollowed spine where he'd hidden the photograph was gone. He'd buried it. I said nothing. Weeks later, we received one final telegram. It was unmarked, sent from a coastal village near Whitby. 5 words. "She plays again. Thank you." No signature. Holmes read it once, then turned to me. "It's enough," he said, and for once, I agreed. Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflection. It was nearing winter when the final chapter of the Kell affair wrote itself, not in action or discovery, but in the silent aftermath. London's streets had taken on the hush of early frost, and the pale smoke rising from chimney pots drew hazy lines in the grey morning light. At 221B Baker Street, the fire was always lit now. Holmes, though no stranger to melancholy, had grown stiller than I had ever seen him. Not morose, not defeated, simply contemplative, like a man listening for echoes long after the concert has ended. I found him by the window that morning, dressed but unmoving, one hand curled loosely around a cooling cup of tea. "You've not touched that," I said, setting down my newspaper. "Observation, Watson," he murmured without turning. "The most precise of instruments, and the most fallible, when tempered by emotion." I said nothing. After a pause, he continued, "Do you recall what I told you when we first met, Kell? That he was too still?" "Yes," Holmes said. "Stillness, not laziness, not hesitation, but the kind born of inner architecture." You see, Kell had already composed the end long before the beginning ever unfolded. He turned to face me. The crime, the boxes, the music, they were not improvisations. They were a fugue, as we agreed. But a fugue is not chaos. It is structure, counterpoint, return. I nodded. "You believe he planned it all from the start?" "I believe he feared that without plan, there would only be grief. And grief, uncontrolled, terrifies men more than any noose." Holmes reached toward the clutter on his desk and retrieved a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me. It was another page of music, no title, no composer's name, but it was dated, the day of Elcott's final public performance, 6 years prior. "Where did you find this?" "In Kell's flat," Holmes said, "hidden inside the back panel of a bookcase." He leaned forward, his voice softer now. "It is her handwriting." "You're sure?" "As sure as one can be of ghost notes, Watson." The melody was incomplete, truncated, unresolved, yet in the margin was a single phrase in Kell's distinct hand. "Let it end on her terms." Holmes stood and walked to the fire, his back to me now. She didn't ask to be avenged, nor did she ask to be remembered. She asked, simply, to be heard. And Kell, in his grief, mistook that request for a commandment. He believed that remembrance required sacrifice. He was wrong. I folded the sheet and set it on the mantel. "What of the others?" I asked. "The ones who died?" Holmes turned to me, his eyes tired but steady. "They died because they could not bear the sound of their own reflections. Kell did not murder with his hands, but with his music, yet the blade was within them all along." We stood in silence. For a moment, both men changed by what we had witnessed. Holmes eventually moved to his chair, and sat with his violin resting across his knees. He plucked a few strings, tuned them carefully. then played the opening line of the fugue we'd come to know too well. It was mournful, it was perfect. Then, after a breath, he shifted, recomposing it mid-air into something gentler, more forgiving, a counter-melody, one of his own. I sat down across from him, watching the transformation unfold in real time, witness to the moment when even Holmes, the most rational of men, allowed emotion to rise through his fingertips and reshape what had once been sorrow. When he finished, he let the bow rest. "It is easy," he said, "to call a man a villain. Much harder to understand the precise moment he stopped being merely a man." I reached for my notebook. "Shall I title this one?" I asked. "The Case of the Fugue Killer." Holmes shook his head. "No," he said, eyes closed. "Call it The Man Who Sat Too Still." And so I did. The case never made its way into the official records. The name Edmund Kell vanished from public discourse, as such names often do. The boxes, recovered and locked away, were catalogued as evidence, but never studied in depth. They remained, as all instruments do, without hands to guide them, silent. But from time to time, Holmes would hum a bar of Kell's fugue under his breath, as though honoring a rival intellect, not in admiration, but in understanding. And I kept the incomplete score. Not for its mystery, but for its mercy. For it reminded me that the sharpest minds may break, not through madness, but through music, and that justice, when stripped of its pageantry, sometimes sounds like forgiveness, even when played in a minor key.